Again, my name is Esparza. My project is engaging the Hispanic community on public lands. It's a multi-agency study and set of recommendations for the city of Montrose. Through this 15-minute presentation, I really want to walk you through some of the background behind my project, why it's relevant right now in this place, a little bit of my methodologies, some of my key findings, and then the recommendations that I issued to the city of Montrose and Delta earlier this month. So in trying to distill my project to 15 minutes, I think this quote really does the best job of it. Demographic change will affect how parks are visited, valued, and who votes on behalf of parks. And if you replace parks with public lands, you start to get this idea that a changing society is going to have very new and unique needs of what their public lands do for them. And that needs to be addressed if these agencies want to be relevant in the coming decades. Put together a quick systems diagram I issued to put a little bit of context around this. Initially, I was just asking a very basic question: why is there a lack of diverse visitation on public lands? In the course of my research before my project, during my project, and based on my findings, these are four main factors for a lack of diverse visitation. Lack of resources, mainly financial, lack of transportation options, a lack of knowledge of public lands, and an overall lack of cultural relevancy of these places. And my project is going to dive into these a little bit, and the recommendations that I issue are based on these four things. I chose to do my project in Montrose, medium-sized community on the western slope of Colorado. Chose it for a few reasons. One, it has a Hispanic population that is fairly representative of the Colorado average and the nationwide average, but it's also a community, as you can see, that is completely surrounded by public lands. So in a lot of ways, this represents a place where we can try strategies on a smaller scale, see what works, and then apply them to different places. For my methodology, I chose to go with interviews, and the reason I chose this qualitative method is that with a new and emerging topic and a potentially smaller sample size, interviews have a lot of power in pulling this rich qualitative data out of a small group of people and really allow you to explore an issue and figure out what are the questions you need to ask next, especially with an issue like this. In total, I had 20 participants over 19 interviews. I had land managers around the Montrose area. I had representatives of the Hispanic community, and I had city officials. I really wanted to get people from different professional affiliations and really see how they perceive this issue and look at what potential strategies they saw and what the challenges to those might be, and begin exploring this idea of partnerships. So based on my interview data and kind of where I wanted this project to go in the future, I have a set of key themes that I identified through my research, and these fed into my recommendations. The first couple were issue relevance, how relevant the issue of diverse visitation is to people from these backgrounds. Do people see this on their public lands? And more importantly, what are the potential reasons for this lack of diverse visitation? As well, I was very interested in what's currently happening right now to address this issue, but even more important than that, what could happen in the future? What strategies aren't in play yet, and why aren't they? What are those challenges to enacting them? I was a little interested in effects on increased diversity, mainly if you get more people out to these potentially fragile places, what are the positive and negative effects? I was interested in partnerships between organizations, who's working with who, but even more important than that, what potential partnerships exist down the road. And then this was a bit of an emergent theme, but transferring lessons learned on other public lands. City parks came up time and time again as a place that the Hispanic community engages with in a meaningful way, and how can the lessons learned there be applied at a state and federal level? During my project, I sat down with participants in interviews and talked about potential reasons for lack of diversity, and these were the ones that came up. And the great thing about this whole list is that there's nothing new here. This has all come up in previous literature. So Montrose, again, is a great place where you can try these out and potentially transfer these solutions. Economic factors was listed as the most commonly cited reason for people not going out on public lands. And this is simply due to the cost of visiting these places, getting to them, buying gear. Lack of exposure really deals with in a person's youth or a young adult, how often they go out to these places and engage with them, and how that leads to stewardship of these places down the road. Differing priorities dives into the unique socioeconomic issues surrounding the Hispanic community and how things like healthcare, food, childcare are often more pressing priorities than going to the Black Canyon for a picnic, and how addressing those socioeconomic issues is a first step in engaging people on their lands. Lack of knowledge of public lands isn't just related to the Hispanic community, but the general community. People generally don't know the types of lands that surround them, the unique opportunities available on those places, and how they can go to them. So this is more of an outreach education theme. And finally, cultural factors is really looking at how a place connects to a person on a cultural level, and how that connection can create a meaningful engagement with that place down the road. As well, there are all these other issues, and again, they were all in previous literature, so they're great that Montrose isn't entirely unique. So for potential strategies for engagement, the one that came out the most from interviews was reaching out to communities. And this is really targeted, meaningful outreach to the Hispanic community versus more of a blanket level initiative. Diverse hiring really looks at having a workforce that represents the community that you're trying to engage with. Infrastructure changes really looks at the things we build and how they connect to one's culture. The best example I can think of here is a picnic table that holds 4 or 6 people. And if you have communities that are coming with a large extended family, just simply the infrastructure doesn't match the cultural needs. And then incorporating public lands knowledge into the educational system, using systems that are currently in play in the community and plugging yourself into those. So some challenges to enacting these strategies. I was very interested in why these things aren't happening yet. The biggest one, everybody mentioned money. These things cost a lot of money to initiate. And land managers are constantly being asked to do more with less. And simply putting these initiatives in play costs money that they don't have. Employee diversity challenges is a huge issue. It's very hard for federal land managers to hire the people that they want because it's a long bureaucratic process. And often that eliminates a lot of qualified and diverse candidates. Priority challenges, anybody who's familiar with land management knows that things like law enforcement and fire are more pressing concerns than diversity initiatives, unfortunately. And diversity initiatives constantly get pushed lower and lower down the list of things that will get funded in the future. And then finally, you have coordination challenges, which is who's going to initiate these things. Land managers, just like the money issue, are being asked to do a lot of different things, and adding one more thing to their plate creates initiatives that don't get carried out fully or meaningfully because they simply don't have the time. So earlier this month, I issued a couple presentations and a set of recommendations to the City of Montrose and to the Delta GoCo working group that's currently working to engage youth on their public lands. And I issued 3 recommendations that I'm going to go over. And the idea with these is I wanted to take my data, previous literature, and the unique demographic needs of these communities, and come up with 3 strategies that could be implemented in the next few years, and present them in a way that is achievable through a small scale at the Montrose level. The first is using city parks as these gateways to public lands. The next is a multi-agency public lands liaison to the community. And the last one is a university public lands partnership. And the idea here is they start out with fairly easy to implement and cheap recommendations, and then more meaningful but also slightly more expensive or logistically complicated recommendations. So I wanted to take some time here to focus on these 3 and talk about how they might be implemented in this community. The idea of using city parks as gateways to public lands really looks at how city parks like La Raza and River Bottom in Montrose are very popular with the Hispanic community. They're places that are comfortable and familiar, and being able to utilize that power in these places really allows these places to serve as a kind of springboard to further engagement on public lands that are often nearly adjacent to these places. This also starts to introduce this idea of partnerships, engaging with the city on their public lands, and connecting federal and state public land managers through that process. Another great thing about these places is that River Bottom specifically has this amazing water sports park. And something about being able to take activities that are familiar and comfortable in this place and building those skills into transferable skills to a further away public land is a great way to rather inexpensively engage multiple partners, multiple stakeholders, and bring people to their close-by public lands in a very safe way, hopefully. The BLM has this motto of backyard to backcountry, and in a lot of ways, these public lands, these parks, are everybody's backyard, thank you, in Montrose, and the backcountry is simply right next to these places. The next recommendation is a multi-agency public lands liaison to the community. And this is really starting to dive into more of the cultural relevancy, creating a bridge between the Hispanic community and their public lands through a person whose job it is to go to these communities, speak with them, and engage in a two-way dialogue of, these are the public lands that surround you, these are the opportunities available, and what needs do you have of these places, and where can we find a place for this community that is worthwhile? This extends the multi-agency partnership model that already exists and creates this sort of community interpretive position that represents all of the public lands. So you have this opportunity for shared funding, so no one organization has to pay for all of this. Instead, all the public lands benefit from one position. And most importantly, this addresses the issue of community gatekeepers, which is really these people within the community who allow you access to, especially in Montrose with the Hispanic community, kind of underground community that you don't see all the time. And being able to meaningfully engage with them and be a part of that community allows you to have a conversation that results in change. The final recommendation is potentially the most far-reaching but takes a little bit of time. It's a partnership between Colorado Mesa University and local land management agencies. It's built in part on a model I'm familiar with UC Merced and Yosemite, but this extends it to a 4-year model that's more relevant for a small community. It has a few overall goals: enrollment and retention in higher education by Hispanic youth, really looking at root level those socioeconomic issues and how simply graduating from college allows people to have a more productive and meaningful future in Montrose. As well, allowing for the process of engaging the Hispanic youth in leadership and community engagement skills, allowing them targeted academic majors and course loads, and internship opportunities that prepare them for working in land management agencies. As well, this connects college graduates with careers in their local lands, and for land managers, creates a recruitment stream down the road, an ability for a local land manager to hire somebody who grew up in that community to manage the lands is a very, very meaningful change. It kind of changes the public lands model in a lot of ways. So some next steps for this project, I would really like to see somebody assess in depth the feasibility, both financial and logistical, for these recommendations, and begin implementing them, and start to monitor how successful they are. And the idea here is apply the lessons learned in the Montrose scale and see if they would work at a state or larger federal level. So in conclusion, if our public lands are to remain relevant in a changing cultural landscape, land management agencies will need to continue their diversity efforts both in the workforce and in their engagement with communities through new partnerships and new strategies. And my project was really meant to be a model that I hope to create here that I can then transfer to other places and different scales. So I used Montrose as a place to create something for myself and a way to apply these lessons to a very, very different place, hopefully. I want to thank you people, first Corey for everything you've done. Thank you for your guidance. Everybody in this room, my research assistant, Erin Kearns, who did all my transcribing for me, the Haley Fund, and everybody who's given me additional guidance through the process. I've really appreciated it. And before we move on to the next presentation and a specific community here in Montrose and their environmental justice issues, I have about 4 or 5 minutes for questions. So if anybody has any questions, now's the time. Thank you. Yes, Ellie.
Andres, would you be willing to talk to the folks about what didn't work
Oh my
to
God.
begin with?
So thinking about community gatekeepers, I assumed that because of my project, at least I thought it was great and awesome and relevant, that everybody else would be engaged with it too. And part of it involved these community forums where I invited members of the Hispanic community to come out and talk about public lands, and really more of an educational forum for what are the unique opportunities available in these places, and how are they culturally relevant, and how can you connect with them? And I had practically zero attendance. And that affected some of the other steps of my project, which included outings to public lands and really trying to create, connections with these places with people who don't normally come out. And overcoming that hurdle was a little bit hard because that was a central piece of my project. But I had to just move forward and in reflecting on it, really looking at how engagement and connection with the community is really important if you're going to make any change at all.
So, Andres, really nicely articulated, right, around the challenges and the benefits for attracting Hispanic community to our public parks. Now, do you know if the agencies have taken an economic approach to attracting Hispanics to parks and perhaps not, only approaching this as a burden, doing more with less?
Right.
So perhaps saying, hey, with additional visitations, perhaps our revenue can increase by so much.
Yeah, right now I think Colorado is, and I think Dominique's project touched on this, is the Colorado Tourism Agency is really looking at how more people are engaging in outdoor activities and the economic boom that's going to have. In interviews, city officials were really keen on pointing out how tourism dollars would be generated by engaging more people. But as far as land management agencies specifically, really all they see is the entrance fee a lot of times and maybe some money from the bookstores. So for them, really, it costs a little bit more money up front, but the political support they're going to get on the back end is a lot more important, especially I think here in Colorado with these ideas of public land sell-offs and resource extraction. Having a support network that would prevent sort of things is the payoff in the long run. Yeah.
You mentioned you'd like to see some of these recommendations implemented and monitored. Is there any structure or plan in place for that to actually happen, or is that potentially an opportunity for a future master's project?
That would be a perfect master's project. And Delta right now, where I presented earlier this month, has a GoCo grant to connect local youth to their public lands. And so I issued my recommendations there in the hopes that they would take some of them and really try to apply them. But at this stage, they're still kind of planning stuff. They haven't really talked about what steps they're going to take. John?
Actually, there's a question. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Chris. I noticed on one of your slides about what came up as barriers to access to public lands. There was some discrepancy between the, I guess, the officials of land agency officials and then members of the Hispanic community.
Yeah.
So the land manager may rank it as, maybe it comes up 3 times, but to the Hispanic community member it's coming up 8 or 9 times.
Right.
Has there been any dialogue started between those 2 groups so that they can maybe get on the same page of what those actual barriers are?
A little bit. There has been some discussion. I think in a lot of ways, especially with representatives of the Hispanic community and land managers, they have very different needs. Really quick example, in trying to get interviews with these representatives, oftentimes I was told I simply don't have the time because the needs of the Hispanic community don't involve public lands right now. We're dealing with more pressing issues. So a lot of times things like that are way more important than having a conversation with a land manager. And that's where that socioeconomic kind of overall theme comes up. In addressing that, then you can start the next conversations. John?
I thought I saw some other hands. Darius?
Yeah.
How did you decide upon who to interview, particularly individuals from the Hispanic community?
So the representatives from the Hispanic community, I really looked at the organizations that work with them and try to get either representatives that were directors or at a higher level who had contact with kind of all the projects that were going on in that community. There weren't a lot, which is why they were the lowest represented group. With land managers, I try to get people from superintendents down to seasonal techs to try to get a variety of perspectives based on what their job is within the organization. And with city officials, again, varying levels of engagement in the civic community. And I used a little bit of snowball sampling where I asked people to recommend another person I should interview. I guess I'll Darius and then I'll go over there.
Yeah, you mentioned the forum that did not work.
Yeah.
As far as engaging community gatekeepers, I'm wondering what did work or how you figured out how to tap into that.
So after the failed outings and forums, I then did the interviews, and I worked with some of the people, the representatives of the Hispanic community, and they talked about essentially that community gatekeeper idea and how in the future, it would be much better to start with the interviews and then do the outings and forums later. But just based on the timeline for my master's project, trying to schedule outings in spring just doesn't work in Colorado. So I wanted to do it in the fall when it made a little bit more sense. But in the future, I'd have to change my timeline a little bit. Mitch?
I've seen conservation crews in AmeriCorps that have focused on the populations they were trying to work with. Have you come across anything in your research that says that that's effective, or?
Yeah, that's huge. I think those volunteer and internship opportunities allow for pathways for working in public lands, and that's a model that would work very well in Montrose. I'm out of time, so thank you very much. Appreciate it.